Woo! Just 1 second. Nearly finished this boss. Actually, I'm only playing around with this, a low poly pixel textured parrot bot. Let's look at how we can get this made. For this video, we'll start by modeling our parrot shape from primitives, utilizing the mirror modifier and 3D cursors to align meshes, as well as the loop tool to keep things circular. We'll make sure we are only using half of our character when creating our UVs, giving ourselves plenty of margins for painting our low-res textures. Also making sure to use the closest interpolation method to avoid softness. We'll then select a brush with constant falloff and then start painting both in the viewport and directly on the texture to build up some base colors initially, and then using a grey overlay texture to work in some faux shading highlights and details. Moving on to the rigging, we will add bones and weights, set a start pose and an end pose, and take advantage of the bounce motion interpolation to quickly give us a little fun animation. And we'll end up with a highly performant 3D model that can be used for real-time application, like Sketchfab, Godot, or even just loading it up in a GLTF viewer online so you can spin your creation around on your phone. This tutorial is for Blender users that are already familiar with the basics, and if you fancy brushing up, then you can check out Zach's Blender beginner tutorial, linked down in the description. Okay, let's jump in with modeling. But before jumping into the nitty-gritty, just a super quick mention that the update to the Robotic Planet course is live, covering a new batch of techniques that were used to create these 2 additional robots, including guide meshes, linking audio to geometry and shaders, IK with hydraulics and cables, and much more. On with the video. Okay, we have a fresh Blender scene open and our concept art loaded into an image viewer here on the right. And as you can see, the geometry we want to achieve is fairly low resolution, in fact even lower than this if we can get to it. And most of the details within, like the eye and the hinge here, can be created with the pixel texture. So let's start generating the geometry here, and we can see that the large part of it is based on simple primitives. So I'm just going to select all here, delete everything, and introduce with Shift and A UV sphere. Now we want to start reasonably low resolution, so let's toggle up our options here and just halve everything, 32 to 16, and rings down to 8. Okay, that looks like a good start. Now we can make sure we are in edit mode with tab, shift on over to wireframe mode, just over here, and orthographic view, snapping to here, and making sure we're on poly select, and I'm just going to select the top hemisphere, hit E, and move it up to create the pill shape of our bird, like so. And in order to retain this shape going forward, we're going to create a duplication. So Shift and D, out in object mode, right click to drop, and hit M and create a new collection, and call this one Pill Guide, and with it selected here, we're just going to, over in our 3D viewport, do Control and 2 to create a subdivision surface. Go into edit mode, create some more cuts like so. And now we have a very high resolution pill to project our low resolution mesh onto, which will serve us in good stead going forward. And to highlight this, let's move on to the next part, which is modeling the leg elements here. Let's rename it also F2 Pill Guide for our high res pill. So we can hide our pill guide temporarily back to our low resolution here. Now moving back to solid mode and just looking around here, we want to extrude a leg element off. And for that we need a circle shape, or as close to a circle as we can get. We want at minimum 4 quad polygons here, like so. Now we could arrange this in a circle and extrude it, but we could also take advantage of an extension called Loop Tools. So if we go into Preferences here and get extensions, search for Loop Tool, and you may need to click Install here, and when doing so, you will have it pop up in your add-ons, and just make sure it is checked to enable it, like so. Now this gives us the ability to right-click Loop Tools and Circle. And toggling up our options here, we've got a couple of methods. And we're just going to uncheck regular here so we have some semblance of uniformity. And that's looking pretty good. So let's just move over here and hit E and then Z to extrude down across our global axis, and then S and Z to scale down across our global axis too. Okay, now we already have something that looks reasonably good, and we can right-click Loop Tools and repeat that operation into a circle. And this time we want to check regular, so we have as close to a uniform circle. Okay, we're just going to hit G and move that down a little bit more, and then X to delete the faces, and maybe another loop here, like so, and scale that along the X. Right-click, Loop Tools, make sure that is a circle, and move it down like so. Just going to scale it up a little bit like that, so we have a little bit of bowed out kind of look. But that looks pretty good, with a little tweak here and there. Cool. Now we're at the point where we don't really want to reproduce our work the other side. So I like to go into wireframe, into edit mode, 3 on the number row to make sure we are in poly select, and just remove the entirety of one side here, so we can afford ourselves the ability to jump in and add a mirror modifier, effectively halving our work when we continue to model things. Okay, that looks good. And for the top part of our head here, let's select these polygons. We can hit P and selection. So we have a completely new model here, and we can work on the beak. So I'm just going to move into solid mode, jump into edit mode, and we want to start the top of our beak from this vertex and have it go down here. So effectively we can use our knife tool with K on the keyboard and just draw a straight line down to this vertex like so. Left clicking and then hitting enter to commit. Now we can jump into our poly select mode again and select all of the polys we don't need and hit X and delete faces. And we can remedy this little n-gon here, a polygon with more than 4 sides, by selecting these 2 vertices, hitting M and merge center. Now with 2, selecting the edges here, we can go in, select these 2 edges, move to this side view here and just extrude a beak. So 1 extrude here, another extrude, and this extrude we're going to merge all of the vertices. So selecting this one, the middle one, and the end one here in the middle, and we want, instead of center, merge at last, and hit G and move things down. Back into edge select here, we want to straighten this out a little bit so we can scale it along the Y and rotate it in place. And tweak a little bit to get the proportions looking good. Okay, looks good. Now we need the bottom part of the beak here. Let's go in. We can do Control R to give ourselves a loop cut. Move it up to here. And for this, we're going to keep it really simple. We're going to just select this vertex, hit G and move it out. We can snap it to the X as well, just to keep it nice and uniform. And then selecting these 2 vertices and hitting J to create a nice defined edge. Okay, that is the main mass of our body done. Let's move up to the head here, jumping into edit mode. And for me, I have a couple of additional stray polygons here that I can delete. Back into edge mode, selecting this top edge here, and we can simply extrude out the first of our large head feathers. So let's go E, extrude it out like so. And we can select the edge here and just grab it and pull it out. And something like that looks good. Let's give ourselves a loop cut here. Hit G and move it out so we get a little bit of a curve. That looks good. And in poly select mode here, 3 on the number row or up here, we can just hit P, separate by selection, and we have a nice head feather that we can use with Alt and D to duplicate with linked mesh. So any edit to one will populate to the others. Let's go with 1, 2, 3, 4 additional. Now, if we jump in to our original here and select the vertex right at the bottom, snap our cursor to it, and then jump back out into object mode and go up to Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. We can arrange our duplicates and rotate it, assuming we are on either median point, individual point, or active element, around that origin point. Cool, just going to align those up nicely. Awesome. Okay, back down to the feet, and we can keep these really simple by jumping in, selecting this loop, Shift and S, cursor to selected, and here we want to create a cube. So Shift and A, cube, and we want to scale that down considerably. Hit P to move it into its own separate object, which I just find easier in a lot of situations. Jump into edit mode, select the bottom of our cube and hit G and move it down. Then hit E and move it down along the Z. A loop cut in between like so, and scale it up. Really simple, as you can see. Now I'm just going to isolate that with / so we can remove our top poly here, X face, and select the top edges here and just hit G and move it up into the leg, so we are not afraid of seeing a hovering leg underneath. And to create our little claw elements here, we can take advantage of the Make Primitive tool here, draw a cube along this poly's normal, extrude out like so, and do the same one more time. I'm going to oversize this one like so. Then we can move it into place with G. I'm just going to join them together. We don't really need these faces here, so we can just select them and hit X, delete faces. And we can scale this end polygon here along the X, nothing, and merge the resulting vertices to create this little claw. So let's select all of these vertices here, hold Alt to snap to the side and move them back a little. Getting the proportions we want. That looks reasonably good to me. And we can select these vertices at the end here and just snap our cursor to it and make sure that the origin point again is set to 3D cursor. Okay, now on the top view here, I'm just going to duplicate these again with Alt and D. Alt and D, so we are creating an object with the linked mesh data in case we want to adjust things after the fact. And just create the remaining shapes, like so. Now for visual reference, we can always hit Shift and D and just move that over to the other side and move on to the snazzy Wi-Fi antennas. And to do that, we're going to jump into edit mode, select a vertex because we want it to come roughly from this area, snap our cursor to it. And while still in edit mode, we want to Shift and A and create a plane. Scale it down, rotate it around, and create the Wi-Fi antenna shape, which is just a matter of moving vertices around until we have something we're reasonably happy with. And we can just intersect that mesh really. So I'm just going to move that into the body like so. And for the head here, we want to have this cool mechanic where the head opens up and reveals the inner workings. So we can use an existing circle of vertices. We've already manipulated this top row, but the one below it is all ready to go. So let's select in edge mode the semicircle here with Alt and left click, and then Shift and D and move it up like so. Then we can hit E and extrude it up like so. Just going to give it a little bit more. Into poly select mode, select all of those. Okay, now we need to scale it down a little bit. And to do so, I'm going to separate it first into its own object, which we can scale like so. Making sure to nest it in the body, then jump into edit mode, maybe into our wireframe and just scale it up again. So we have enough overlap that we don't see down towards the end. Okay, one final element to go, and that is the wings here. And this is going to be really simple. Let's use our existing geometry. I'm going to create another loop cut around here where we can spawn, if you like, our wing from. So if we select these two edges, and we're just going to hit E and extrude out along the X axis here. and it doesn't need to be too far. Let's create a cut with Control and R. Let's scale this along our Y. Now we don't even need our wing to be attached to the geometry here, so I'm just going to go into Poly Select, select all of the wing geometry and just hit P and separate by selection so we can refine it a little further. So I think we want to go into a tip at the bottom here, so I'm going to select these two outside points and then the middle one and then merge at last. And we want a little bit more depth here, so I'm just going to scale 0 and then hit Control and B to create a little bit of a bevel here. Move things around. I think the root here is a little bit too wide, so let's scale this down, making sure that we are on bounding box center, so we have a nice even scale. And again, this is very much about tweaking the shape to taste. And because it's going to rotate, I'm going to select these edges and just scale along the X, and that can intersect into the body like so. Now let's pivot around our 3D cursor here. So I'm going to shift and right click for our 3D cursor and make sure our transform pivot point is set to 3D cursor, so we can move it around and just see what it looks like. Yeah, I think that looks good. Okay, let's hit undo and move it up to where it was before. Now earlier on we created this pill guide and we didn't really use it throughout our operations, but just to give you an indication of where it would have come in handy, if, for example, when creating our leg extrusions here, something went amiss, you know, the things went out of place like so, we could have always created a vertex group to realign to our pill shape. So for example, let's just select the polygons that we wanted to keep in the pill form and move over to our vertex groups, create a new group and assign. Then we could have added a modifier, shrink wrap, moved it before our mirror, selected our pill guide, and used that group to just make sure that everything moved back into that pill shape. And then any adjustments we would have done would still adhere to that pill shape. So it's a good way just to retain the shape in case any operations move it away from our desired look. But before we do, if you would just allow me a moment of your time to talk about a course I have recently finished. If you like robots and you have ever wanted to create animations like these from scratch, then I have the course for you. We start slow building BasicBot while covering the theories behind concepting, modeling, procedural materials, animation, compositing, and more. Armed with this information, we will dive headfirst into FishBot, building more complex shapes, rigs, and animation, utilizing more tools including geometry nodes to realize our goal, while maintaining flexibility throughout. We will then look at creating the unique mechanisms of 3 further robots that could help you solve problems when creating your bots. Like IK with hydraulics and cables, LCD screen effects, linking audios to rigs and shaders, and looking at optimized workflows that enable crowds of bots with minimal memory overhead. There is over 15 hours of this course hosted on CG Boost Academy, which also gives you access to the support Blender files so you can pick up from wherever, as well as access to support messaging and a large community of artists to share your progress with. Before we can get into painting pixel textures, we need to give Blender some coordinates, i.e. creating UVs. And to do so, we're going to try and be as optimized as possible. And to start, we need to join all of our objects together. Thankfully, most of our objects have the exact same single modifier, the mirror modifier. So we can just select the head, the inner section, the body, the wings, and the legs too, and then just hit Ctrl and J. And then uncheck the mirror, so we are seeing only half of the elements here. And for the time being, we're going to delete this, which we were only really using as a visual reference. And we're going to continue by deleting the rest of our claws as well. And the same here, we again only really need one of these items, so I'm just going to delete this and uncheck the mirror modifier. Now we can complete our look by selecting the body here, searching for decimate, and turning down the ratio until we get some nice triangulation. I'm just going to switch on wireframes here, and I think something like this could look really nice. Now we can select all our items here, and we want to apply all visible modifiers. Now we can do that one by one by just going into here and hitting apply or Control and A, or we can, with everything selected, right click, convert to mesh, which effectively does the same thing. Now we can select everything and select our body here, Control J, and we have one complete mesh, or half without a few toes. Now the UV process is quite easy, particularly for this with a lot of open faces, but to make things a little bit easier, we're going to go in and highlight some edges where we want the borders of our soon-to-be UV islands to be. So to do so, we can go into edit mode, select the edges, Control and E, and mark seam. Again, I'm going to do this down here by the leg, using Control and left click to select shortest path, mark seam, and we can have another cut here in the middle, mark seam, and again, let's have one going off the back here, mark seam, and let's separate the beak here because they'll be quite different in color. Looks good. Now we only have our foot area to go, so let's mark seam here. And for the toe, we can mark this entire triangular area as well as the edges, just so we don't have much distortion. Okay, just the leg to go now. Let's choose the inside and create seams like so. And to complete our faceted look, we're just going to select everything. We'll go to face, triangulate, and with that done, we are ready to UV. So let's first make sure we are on our UV editor, and we want to have everything selected here, and then just hit U and unwrap angle based. And you can see here, if we synchronize our selections with this button up in the top here, I'm just going to go to poly mode and hit L, we can see all of the different sections we have. Now, this looks good, but because we're going to be working with incredibly low resolution textures, these margins are quite small. They are almost, in some cases, touching. So to remedy that, let's just select all and hit U. Again, we're going to do angle base, but this time toggle up our options here, and we want a much larger margin. Something like this looks good. Okay, that's our UVs all set up. I'm going to re-add a mirror modifier so we can see our progress. And as you can see here, we have a little bit of some offsets here. So we can always just go in, select our vertices, snap our cursor to world origin, and just scale X0. Okay, let's get painting our polygons here. So to do so, we need a texture. And if we move on over to our shader editor, go over to our material view here, let's click new and call our material just RGB. Let's keep it simple. And we want to drag out a texture from our emission. I know this seems counterintuitive, but we're mainly going to be painting in the lighting, so we don't want any kind of specular or shading. So let's search for an image texture, again color. And while we're at it, let's just reduce the base color to black. We don't want any of that. Specular also, none of that. And our strength will be 1. And we want to create a new texture, call it RGB. And both channels here, we want to be 128 pixels, pretty low. And our base color, let's go with a really vivid, almost cyan blue. Cool, we've created our new image here, which we can see if we jump on over to our image viewer and select RGB from the top here. And we can also switch on to paint mode here, so that when we do paint, we can also paint from this 2D viewport or our 3D viewport. The choice is ours. Now we can switch on over to our viewport options, change it to flat and texture so we can see our texture directly as it is. And while we're at it, because we want to render it effectively as a standard sRGB texture for monitors, we can move on over here, make sure our color management is just on standard. So we don't want any highlight roll off that the gamma curves of Filmic or AGX can produce. And with that done, let's start painting in some of these details here. So we can jump into edit mode and just hit L to select an element, making sure to delimit by seam. So we're on poly mode here and we have seam selected on select linked. Then we can jump into texture paint either with Control and Tab or up here in our mode section. And then on fill mode, making sure we check our limit by poly option here, we can select a color. Let's go with an orange. Orange beak seems good, and fill it in. And you can start to see why we created such large margins here, because we are working with a low res texture and have enough bleed, which is controllable over here in the options section, to cover the entirety of our poly. Okay, let's rinse and repeat this. First of all, I think the feather here could be nice and pink. Back out, and I think inside here, as well as the leg elements, could be a purple color, maybe quite dark as well. And then for the body here, I think it would be nice to create a gradient. So back into texture mode, and this time we're going to use the brush tool, and we're going to change a few settings, making sure the fall off is on linear and stroke is on line. And in options here, we're going to temporarily uncheck occlude and backface culling. This gives us the ability to paint effectively through the model, which is limited again by our poly mask here. So we can select a color. We want to start with the blue here. And to sample that, we can do Shift and X to sample that blue. And then move on over the hue to a green sort of color here. And scaling up the brush quite a bit, let's paint in a nice gradient. Oops, we were on screen mode there, making sure we are on mix mode. Very nice. Let's move that color wheel over to yellow. And finally over to orange. Cool, for a nice little gradient here. We've missed a few polygons, not to worry. Let's move on over to our options, re-enable occlude. And re-enable backface culling, and then we can just fill that in like so. And of course, we can also jump here into the 2D viewport at any point, and making sure our brush isn't too ginormous, fill in that detail just to make sure we are capturing everything. Okay, looks good. I think we could include a nice little bit of gradient on the beak here as well, maybe going to a red color. That could be pretty cool. Awesome. Okay, that's our base colors sorted out. Now let's go into some of the details. Let's start by arranging our workspace a little and re-inspect our concept art, making sure also to uncheck the display texture paint overlay so we don't get our wireframes over the top, and also using these pin tools just to make sure that our image settings don't change when we change, for example, over to view. The top one will remain as paint. Okay, so we can start working in an eye here. So let's just isolate this with just the head. And we want to jump back into our texture paint mode. And let's go for an initial color of orange here. And the fall off, we don't really want this sort of faint fall off anymore. We want a really hard pixel line. So let's go to constant. And stroke we can keep with a line here because we can create very small lines. And let's put our initial eye element right here. And you can see that even though we have selected constant, it's still fuzzy. And this is because we need to adjust our image properties here from linear interpolation to closest. This is the same as nearest neighbor in Photoshop or many image editing apps. So now we have this really nice hard edge. And jumping back to our image editor here, let's create the black pupil within it. Going down to black here, just zooming in a bit. Yeah, that looks better. And I'm going to go back to the orange, but this time with Shift and X. When we move away, sometimes the color switches back. So to remedy this, I sometimes click in this color palette option just to make sure we are on that color. And now I'm going to scale down a little bit and create a little sort of amber trim around the edge. Yeah, that looks quite nice. And we can mimic that on the body here. So selecting that link, like so. Cool. And now we have the eye in place. We want to create this sort of hinge detail. And I think we just want a gray really for that, so it can feel like more of a metal. So let's go in and start painting that in. Looks good. I'm going to get a smaller brush here so we can really make it square. Cool. Now we can select the wing and do roughly the same here. Oops. Maybe give it a bit more size. Now, as you can see, we're not painting on this wing. It's just not allowing us to do anything, but we can paint on the underside. This is because our normals need to be flipped around. If we can see, if we check our face orientation here, our normals are pointing down effectively. So we can flip that with Alt and N and then flip. And this allows us to go back into paint mode and continue painting. But I would quite like the edge to be a nice straight line rather than this jaggedy kind of look. And we can actually remedy that now by going into UV editor and just rotating that whole island like so. Give it a bit more space here. Then go back to our paint texture. And when we paint in now, we can see that it's a nice straight line. We have some left over here, so let's just remedy that. Shift and X, select. Ooh, make sure we got that selected nicely, and just paint out. Okay, and I'm going to use the 2D viewport here again to select that grey color, and making sure we're on image editor and paint again. Scale our brush way down, and just paint in the remaining edges here, just to make sure we have everything covered. And also while we're in this viewport, I think it would be nice to create a kind of hinge look like that. Cool. Now we want to paint in our pixel-like shading, including adding some nice highlights. And to do so, we're going to do it as non-destructively as possible by creating an image that overlays on top of our current base color here. So to do that, let's move on over to our shader editor here. And we want to create a new image texture. So let's switch it on over to closest like before, create new, and this will be our shading, and our width and height will be 128. And our color here will be 0.735. And this is middle gray. Middle gray for our gamma correction here for our view transform. And to be fair, I had to use ChatGPT to work this particular middle value out. Hey, Louis from the future here, and I was complicating things just the tiniest bit, because what we can actually do is, again, create our shading image here. So just like we did before. And this time we can just choose 0.5, which is middle gray, I think you would agree, and change our color space to non-color. And now when we introduce it into the mix, so adding the color on top via the blend mode overlay, you can see the result, straight RGB image and overlay is exactly the same. But you will realize that we can no longer use our solid view because this chain of nodes is a little bit too complex. So we're going to move over to our material preview here. And now we can move on to creating some nice highlights and lowlights by selecting our shading node here. Let's just switch back to image editor so we can see our parrot reference. And over in texture mode or texture paint mode here, we can just check we have our constant fall off and start painting in some of those nice highlights. And to do so, we just need a slightly brighter gray. So if we start painting that, you can see we have these nice highlights up here. So I'm just going to draw those in like so, carry that on around the edge here. And I think we can do one all the way across. Just isolating it here with the main body part and the beak, and here along the top could be some nice to have a little bit of catch light here down the middle of our beak and along the edge. Again, let's just jump into isolation mode. I think we could go along the top here, following that line as if it was a highlighted panel. And again, along the side, I think we could create a nice kind of paneled look. Something like that looks nice. And for the remainder, I think we can switch off our wireframe here to get a slightly better impression of things. Let's move on to the feather. Same deal, I'm just going to give it a little bit of edge highlighting everywhere. Going to increase the power of our highlight here by changing it to white. And we can do the same along the middle and maybe give it a little indication of feathers here. Yeah, I think that looks really nice. And just basically drawing highlights where the light would hit, so from the top down. And we can create this little indentation, some highlights around the legs here. Moving on to the wing. Let's create a nice wing effect here by giving it some faux feathers and again some highlights. And I think we could do the same here, creating a nice sort of angled look, giving it that robotic vibe. Okay, looking good. Now we have some of those highlights in. Let's switch on over to some shading. You can see the effect of that. Let's just reduce the gray a bit. That looks good to me. And we can start continuing that look. Okay, just speeding through that a little bit. And I'm going to isolate just the center part here because we want to create this sort of intricate detail within. So we can start with the lowlights here, just looking at the front. Going to create a kind of faux speaker. Something like that looks good. Little speaker cone in the middle bit here. Really simple. And then create some nice as if hydraulics. And some just generic lines going through, which could mimic wiring or the like, or just kind of look a bit sci-fi really. Bit visually interesting. Okay, let's go back to our brighter color here and pick out some highlights. Yeah, that's looking nice. Cool, there we go. Let's just unhide all the other items here. And to add to the icing on the cake a little bit here, we are going to jump back to our RGB texture just by selecting it like so. A full white texture, and we want to add an eye highlight here just to give it a bit more life. Kind of like what you see here. So we can just plop that in like so. That's already looking a lot better. Cool. Now if we jump back over to our images here, you can see we have our RGB image. And we want to make sure to save that. And our shading image here. And again, we want to save that. Now, of course, after the fact, we can adjust our overlay strength here. I think something like that's quite nice. And create an additional texture map with the exact same settings as before. But call this one baked. Select the image here. And we want to switch our render engine over to cycles. And go down to bake here. And bake type, we just want our emission. And we want the baked here. So we can just hit bake. And that bakes in our texture. I'm just making sure that's the closest. And we have now this whole chain of textures baked into one texture. And we can plug that in like so. We don't really need these anymore. And we just have that one baked texture. So let's just save that as baked and switch on back to Eevee. Now we can look at rigging our parrot bot. Okay, it's time to move on to rigging, but firstly we need to make sure all of our geometry is okay. And to do so, first of all, let's hit G and move it up just to make sure it is above the ground ever so slightly. And we can jump in and separate our toe here with P on the keyboard. Jump into edit mode, and we want to Shift D to create duplicates. Just making sure to rotate around the bounding box center. One more. Now we can apply our mirror modifier over here with Control and A to apply, and do the same here with apply, and join everything together by selecting the feet, then the body, and then Control J. We also want to bring back the feathers here. So let's duplicate them with Shift and D and just position them into place. And now we can move on to the rig. Okay, we have our beautifully textured parrot here and we are ready to start rigging. And to do so, we're just going to snap to the side view here and introduce a bone. So Shift and A, armature. And over in our armature options, just make sure we have in front checked here so we can see what we're doing. And for the first bone, we're going to leave it as is, but scale it down a little bit. This will be our root bone. Now, if we hit Shift and D, we can duplicate up our body bone, which we'll put here, roughly where it would pivot from, although it's not particularly important with this character. Shift and D, move up for the head here, scale it down a bit. And for the feathers, it'd be nice to animate these, so Shift and D. And as long as we line up the base of the bone to the base of the feather, we can then make sure we are on active element to rotate the bones in roughly the same orientation as the feathers, like so. Then Shift and D here for the Wi-Fi antenna, making sure, because it is definitely not in the center, to offset it like so. And we're going to also create Shift D a bone exclusively for the foot here, because we'll be shifting up the body up and down, and we want the foot to stay where it is. And finally, one for the wing. So we're going to select our body bone, Shift and D, rotate it 90 degrees and plop it here, making sure, yes, that looks good. Now with our wing selected, we want to rename it. So F2 on the keyboard, let's just call it wing_L. And this can be foot_L, and this can be Wi-Fi_L. And this gives us the power to select those three bones, go to armature and symmetrize. And this just flips it over the other side and creates an _R suffix. Now we need to parent things up. So let's select all of these head feather bones, parent them to the head, Control P, keep offset. Head to the body, Control P, keep offset. We want the wings here to the body as well. And the Wi-Fi antennas to the body, and the legs here to the root, as well as the body to the root. And the reason we aren't parenting the legs to the body is because we want to shift the body up and down and have the legs stay where they are. Okay, let's go through and do our due diligence here by going into edit mode and just renaming a few of the bones we haven't already named. So start with the head here, F2, head, F2, a body, F2, root. And then these bones here can all be called, and this time we're going to use Control and F2, set our selected to bones, and set name, new, and we'll call it head_feathers, and OK. And this just creates numbered variants, 1, 2, 3, 4, perfect. And with our bones nicely renamed, we can parent our mesh to our armature by selecting the mesh, shift-clicking the armature, Control and P, and we want to do an armature deform, but we don't want to use automatic weights. We want to use empty groups so we can assign our weights manually. So let's just click that. And if we select our mesh and move over to our mesh options here, we can see we have all of our bones as vertex groups. And if we were to click our armature and then shift click our mesh, we can do Control and Tab and go into weight paint mode. And then if we click up here in the left hand corner, the bone icon, and then alt click a bone of choice, it will auto switch to the associated vertex group or weight. So for example, we can select the head here, move on over to our polymask option, and then hover over the head and hit L to select both sections here. And then we want to set our weight to 1, which you can do via the menu, via set weight. And also, if you saw the shortcut here, Control and X. So we want the weight to affect the inside cylinder here as well. So let's just hit L, Control and X. And then we can move over to our bone option and select the next bone. Let's go with the body here, Alt and left click, back to the polymask, Alt and A to select nothing, and then hitting L to select the items we want, and Control and X. We can also use the 3, so 1, 2, and 3. 3 on the number row, again to select the bone here, and then 1 on the number row, and then Alt and A, L, Control X, and you can see how we can plow through this reasonably quickly, just making sure we have everything selected here. It's a bit laborious, but I found that this is the fastest way to get through it. Okay, that is theoretically all the items. Now all we have to do is test, so we can go into pose mode with Control and Tab with our armature selected, and then move our items around. That looks good. Okay, looking good, looking good. The head, perfect. All of these, excellent. I'm just going to switch on over to individual origins. Okay, good. What is the use of a rig without a little bit of animation? And we're going to go lo-fi on this and make it as easy as possible by setting up effectively 2 poses. So to start with, we need our start position. It's going to make sure we are on frame 1 here and switch on our auto key. And let's just create the first pose. You can also switch on mirror pose as well to make it a little bit easier. Okay, and just check as well that we are on individual origins. Looks good. And collapse these down a little bit. I'm just going to move this one down into the head so it doesn't have any of the root of it coming through. Just see what that looks like. Yeah, and do the same up here as well. I'm just hiding the overlays just so we can see what we are working with better. And that shortcut is Shift Alt and Z. Okay, that's our start pose, and what I also like to do is just commit a key to all of our bones here. Let's duplicate that key out to frame 20 and move over to frame 50, and then we'll do our end pose. First of all, let's reset everything with Alt and R and Alt and G. Grab our head, move it up a little bit. Maybe we can have this go even more crazy. That could be cool. And I think we can bring these down a little bit. Okay, select all and hit I to add a key, and then Shift and add some hold frames here. So we have our animation up to 80. Let's see what it looks like. Pretty dull, pretty dull. But we can jazz it up a little bit. If we move up our timeline here with our cursor over the timeline, hit Control and Tab, we go into the graph mode. And here we can select our keys between 20 and 50 where we have the animation. Hit T, and we're going to use dynamic effects. We're going to use bounce. Yeah, it's looking a bit more fun. And I'm going to go Control Tab, bring it in. Maybe we can make this a bit faster. Let's go from 20 to 40 frames. Yeah, that feels nicer. And let's end at 60 frames. Change our animation frame rate to 30, which nicely fits into the 60 Hz of most monitors and phones. Okay, we have our funky animation here. Now let's look at how we can export it and use it somewhere that isn't just exclusively Blender. So with everything selected over in the 3D viewport, hitting A on the keyboard, we can go to File and Export, and then we can go down to GLTF 2.0. Now we can choose a location, and let's call it Pixel Poly Parrot V1. And just looking at these settings here, don't really need any shape keys. We want to include selected objects. Everything else looks good. So let's export. And now you can use any manner of online services like Sketchfab or even a GLTF viewer like the one listed here, and just drag and drop your object on, and it will load up with animation as well. And this is the final product. So let us know how yours turned out on our various social media channels. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of robots, then I have a whole course called Robotic Planet, which covers the entire production of these 2 bots, as well as some cool techniques that can be used to create these further 3 robot critters. I hope to see you there.